The night swallows sound like a secret being buried. Listen, there's a crackle under the hush, a fossilized thing burning slow beneath the world's polite stories. You were taught to believe history is a ledger of dates and polite victories. I am here to unbalance that ledger. This first truth is simple and blunt. Power breeds quiet crimes, and quiet crimes breed the furnace of revenge. Tonight, I will take you to a place where that furnace was fed by wood, by sweat, and finally by the deliberate will of a single man who would not be made small. Hear me now like a mentor handing you a key. What you are about to hear is dangerous because it lets you recognize how justice and vengeance can mirror each other when institutions are rotten from the inside. In 1856, in a stretch of pine country where the trees smell like money and rot together, a man named Lazarus lived with his hands stained amber from the work no one wanted to see. He was owned, yes, legally property, but his mind belonged to nobody. That detail matters. In those isolated camps, overseers were gods with whips and ledgers. They carved lives into quotas and fines, turned bodies into accounts, and taught men like Lazarus the precise measures of humiliation. There is a calculus to cruelty. It is taught, learned, practiced. It has rhythms and loopholes. If you sit with that thought, that cruelty behaves like a predictable machine. You begin to understand how one man might begin to dismantle it. Do not mistake this for spectacle or revenge porn. This is a study in agency. The story we're going to follow is not just about fire. It's about the architecture of control that made such an act feel not only conceivable but certain in the heart of a man who had nothing left to lose. I will speak plainly. The men Lazarus faced were not simply brutal. They had built a small empire of theft and sadism inside the Indus. I want you to feel the landscape as if you are standing beside him. Imagine miles of long-leaf pines, an ocean of trunks, the canopy a cathedral without mercy. The industry of naval stores turned those trees into a commodity. Tar, pitch, resin. The work was nearly invisible to the polite world. Men vanished into the wood, returning only bruised and silent. The camps were remote by design. Isolation kept cruelty unchecked. Supervisors could invent rules in the dark, and no one would notice until the bodies were too broken to speak. In such pockets, hierarchy becomes law, and law becomes superstition. Lazarus lived inside that shadowed economy. He was tall, watchful, hands calloused by years of scraping resin, the residue of pine embedded in every line of his skin. He had learned an illicit skill, to read. He taught himself from discarded newspapers, stole letters of the world like contraband light. Literacy was a kind of theft for a man whose life had been catalogued and priced. Quietly, behind the chipped spoons and the oil lamps, he read the language of merchants, the patterns of transactions, the way numbers bent toward greed. That knowledge didn't make him less enslaved, but it made him dangerous in a way they could not imagine. There were 9 men who ruled the operation. They wore authority like armor and cruelty like currency. Each had a method. One loved the lash, another preferred the slow administration of humiliation, another balanced fines like a chess player. They were poor men elevated into petty monarchs by the system they served, and they used that elevation to accumulate wealth and to hide their theft. Barrels of unreported resin, secret ledgers, a shadow network of buyers who bought without questions. The men were connected not by honor, but by mutual blackmail. Somewhere in that machination lay a vulnerability Lazarus would learn to read. I will not make heroes of victims nor monsters of systems without proof. But I will tell you this, when people are assigned the role of less than, when their voices are treated like errors in an accounting book, something ancestral wakes. A man remembers how to be a man apart from the ledger. When you begin to see the careful arrangements of cruelty, the meetings, the secret sales, the pockets of power, you understand that systems are not mute. They speak in ways that teach people how to behave. Lazarus listened. He watched, and in watching, he learned not only where they hid their sins, but how their sins were also their chains. You need to know Dina. The story's teeth bite harder when you remember names. She was not a footnote. She was a life. Laughter that cut through the monotony. Hands that stirred porridge and hope. A body carrying new life inside. She was Lazarus's anchor, and the reason the world narrowed to a single focused pain when it was taken. The brutality done to her was not an isolated cruelty. It was a ritual to remind everyone what obedience costs. The supervisors used her hunger, her pregnancy, her small acts of tenderness as raw material in their theater of power. One night, in a way men in power always arrange, she was taken. Some accounts speak of force, others of strategy. What all accounts agree on is how the silence afterward became a weapon. The men gathered, torches like sentries in a clearing, and punished the man who resisted. They made a public theater of his suffering to send a lesson through the ranks. Lazarus was flogged until blood marked the earth like a ledger account settled with cruelty. He was dragged west, sent to the swamps, to a harsher posting where mosquitoes were legion and the water hid the slow rot of winter. They thought exile would break him. They miscounted. While in exile, his pain tempered into calculation. Grief does not always explode. Sometimes it crystallizes into a patient geometry. The loss of the child, Denina's later removal and sale, each act stacked into the architecture of his resolve. You don't need me to romanticize his feelings. Understand this plainly. What you are witnessing is a person transforming grief into a plan, not because he sought spectacle, but because the system left no other place for justice to live. When institutions refuse to be accountable, individuals make different choices, and those choices will demand answers you are not prepared to give. I will not dramatize cruelty beyond what matters. The important thing is that the men who broke Dina also built the conditions that let them be destroyed. That paradox, that a system's secrecy is always its Achilles heel, is the axis on which this story turns. Lazarus learned their patterns, their meetings, their greed. He learned the ledger of their sins. That knowledge was the ember that would not die, the thing he smuggled back from the swamp and learned to cultivate without ever crossing into instruction. Remember, power leaves tracks. You only have to know where to look. Listen to how systems hide their rot. They do it elegantly. Small adjustments, understated omissions, the illusion of normalcy. The 9 supervisors did not simply brutalize the workforce. They ran a private economy inside the forestry business. They underreported production, hoarded barrels of resin, and sold to buyers who refused questions. They kept ledgers, not of profit and loss in the owner's sense, but of sins recorded to ensure mutual silence. That ledger was not paper and ink alone. It was leverage. It made betrayal unthinkable because betrayal meant mutual destruction. Lazarus discovered the ledger not by accident, but through patience. He learned the rhythms of the supervisor's nights, when they played cards, when they drank, when their pride loosened. He read their faces like maps. He found slips, a door left unlocked, a drunken boast. He committed to memory the numbers and transactions that mapped their theft. The ledger told him 2 things. First, the men felt invulnerable. Second, their invulnerability was built on mutual dependency and concealment. Where there is mutual dependence, there is also a seam. I want you to feel the cold clarity of that realization. For men raised in systems that demand obedience, the notion of a seam, a weakness in the armor, is intoxicating. It is the first moment you understand you are not entirely owned by the ledger. Lazarus's literacy gave him more than words. It gave him a private language for the men who thought their crimes were safe. He did not adopt vengeance as spectacle. He treated it like necessary arithmetic. He cataloged injustice and converted it into the elements of a response that would force the ledger's authors to reckon. Do not interpret this as endorsement of violence. Interpret it as a study in how power fractures when its accounting cannot stand up to scrutiny. The supervisor's secret commerce was not just theft. It was a moral corrosion. And morality, like anything else, must be accounted for. In studying their books, Lazarus was learning how to expose the lie without their consent. The revelation of truth is itself a kind of revolution. The rest is consequence. You must understand the swamp where Lazarus was sent. This ground is a teacher. It is a place where patience is learned by surviving the persistent irritations of a world that refuses to comfort you. The pines there were stunted, the soil waterlogged, the air thick with insects that make sleep a treacherous thing. He was given the worst section not merely as punishment, but as a calculated method of erasure. They wanted him to be small, to fail, to disappear. Instead, he became methodical. He watched how the vapors hung low in hollows, how smoke behaved in tight spaces, how resin reacted to heat. I will not and cannot give you operational instructions. That would be irresponsible. But I will tell you this. Knowledge gleaned from surviving, observational intelligence, is different from technical instruction. Lazarus observed how small fires behaved in storage sheds, and how the forests reacted to sudden flame, and he catalogued those observations mentally. For you, as a listener, there is a lesson in that distinction. Knowledge can be used to build or to dismantle, and the difference is the moral choice behind it. In those months of exile, grief became something honed rather than frenzied. He became excellent at appearing compliant. He did the work others could not, earned small freedoms, and used them to read, to hide scraps of ledger in his mind, to learn the routines of the men who would soon return to their reckless confidence. When you are forced into a corner, observe. That is the survival skill they did not anticipate. They thought fear would shrink him. Instead, it sharpened his focus. There is a dark elegance to the way a man can make patience into power. Notice how I say elegance, not approval. Elegance in grief is a tool for understanding, not a celebration of violence. Lazarus's transformation was not the eruption of a monster. It was the work of a mind, or to adapt, to make sense of injustice, to prepare for the day when the ledger of cruelty would no longer be allowed to govern fate. Let's look at the human economy of the camp. Food rations, fines that were impossible to pay, arbitrary sales, the casual exchange of bodies like surplus stock. These are the mechanics of degradation. The supervisors used humiliation as currency, extracting compliance with the dexterity of men who had learned to rationalize cruelty as management. They told themselves they were keeping order. They told themselves profit was the only metric worth defending. When you live inside such logic, empathy calcifies into a ledger entry. Lazarus watched how they justified everything with numbers. He saw how a man's worth could be reduced to a unit of production. This numerical framing is a powerful control method. It teaches people to measure themselves by output and not by life. The supervisors used it to render the men efficient and obedient, to absolve themselves of responsibility. But when people are reduced to numbers, they begin to think like numbers. A person becomes a variable, and variables can be manipulated. That's the psychological kernel of this tale. Lazarus weaponized the psychology of the men who believed themselves untouchable. He did not confront them openly. He did not make dramatic speeches. He moved within the language they respected, the ledger, the meeting, the ritual of their card games. He used observation and silence as currency. Every time they pocketed a barrel, every time they added a false entry, they burrowed a deeper hole that would eventually swallow their safety. Their moral bankruptcy had a pattern. Identifying it required no heroics, only careful attention. When power is corrupt, it produces patterns repeating in mundane acts. A ledger altered here, a woman sold there, a lash dealt for entertainment. These patterns are a map. Lazarus plotted the map and kept it in memory. What the world had called small cruelties, he read as coordinates lial, ding toward accountability. That is the first principle you must take from this. To dismantle an abusive system, you must learn the grammar of its abuses. Only then can you speak its language back to it. Now consider the ledger itself, not just as a book, but as the nervous system of the supervisor's conspiracy. It documented their theft, their complicity, the names of buyers. It was the instrument that prevented any one man from going public. Knowing that betrayal meant exposure, they kept a mutual pact of silence. Leviathan-like, the ledger sustained them. But every ledger is also a liability. Records that bind you to others are proof against you when the world decides to read them differently. Lazarus found the ledger because men are sloppy with what they think of as their own. Pride creates small openings, a loose floorboard, a drunken confession, a door left unlatched. He memorized entries. He observed distributions. He learned, without ever touching the paper, the shape of their crimes. There is a monstrous irony here. Those who steal from the system do so to shield themselves, but in doing so, they rely on a system of secrecy that pure exposure can topple. This is where strategy replaces rage. Lazarus's plan was not a spontaneous flame. It was an act conditioned by evidence and timing. He understood that simply telling the plantation owners about the missing barrels would do little. The system protected the supervisors, and the owners were likely to believe men of property over men in chains. He also knew the ledger itself was proof they could not destroy without implicating one another. The ledger's existence meant there was leverage. Leverage is the currency of the oppressed when laws offer no recourse. Again, I will not provide a roadmap to violence, but I will insist on a central truth. Exposure is a form of power that frightens the corrupt more than any sword. If you can render a hidden economy visible, you change the rules of engagement. Lazarus recognized that the ledger was both shield and vulnerability, turning it into a force that would destabilize. Either shared impunity required patience, timing, and a moral calculus he had made while they slept. There is a moral grammar to what follows. This is not the story of a man who simply snapped. This is the study of how systems of humiliation can produce an inevitable fracture. When a community tolerates theft and cruelty, when it is cultivated by those entrusted with management, the people under it learn the rhythms of destruction, and over time, the ability to use those rhythms against their masters. Lazarus did not become a killer because he loved killing. He became an agent of consequence because his world had offered no lawful consequence for the crimes committed against him and those he loved. In the months leading up to the act, watch how his behavior changed only superficially. He increased his productivity, became indispensable, a model worker. That is always a cunning move when survival demands it. Hide in plain sight, become the reliable instrument, and watch where the powerful make their mistakes. They never expect finesse from the ones they've broken. Arrogance blinds them. It gives you the breathing room to plan. Lazarus used that breathing room to map the nights the supervisors gathered, to memorize turns of phrase, to learn which man kept the keys, and to understand the routes their secret wagons took. Note the psychology at play. The supervisors believed they were untouchable because they dictated the narrative of what was normal. And narratives can be toppled by evidence and spectacle. The clandestine commerce that enriched them was simultaneously their coffin if it could be made public in a way they could not contain. Understanding that is not strategy for arson. It is the recognition that corrupt systems are brittle at their joints. Lazarus hunted those joints with patient cruelty. A clarity born of grief. This is where the story tightens. The men met like clockwork. Poker nights, laughter, the slurring confidence of men drunk on power and resin fumes. They joked about sales, about girls, about the plantation owners who believed them. In their mirth, they counted their gains and, in doing so, exposed the cadence of their theft. Lazarus watched. He did not rush. He wanted certainty. He wanted the injustice of Dina's removal to be recognized, not obliterated by another crude act of violence from a man crushed by sorrow. Over time, practical details aligned with his patience. The supervisor's routines, the pattern of their gatherings, the way they stored and moved unreported barrels. It is critical you hear this as evidence of his resolve, not a blueprint. He cultivated an invisible presence, a man who could step inside their assumptions and observe. He waited for a night when their arrogance would be absolute, when their guard would be gone, a night when they thought themselves invincible. Now do what I ask, not because I command you, but because this ritual matters. If this story resonates with something inside you that has been taught to obey, type the phrase, "I see the ledger" twice in the comments below. Type it once to say you heard it. Type it again to claim you understand how systems teach obedience. Do it now, twice. This small act is more than engagement. It is a symbolic recognition that you are awake to the structures I am revealing. It anchors you, publicly, to the idea that truth matters more than comfort. The algorithm will register your move. The tribe will notice. Whether you mean it as performance or as pledge is your own calculus. But do it. See the ledger. See the ledger. After your act of recognition, return your attention to the work of unmaking. The consequence of seeing is that you can no longer pretend ignorance. Lazarus could no longer pretend. He had counted and remembered, and now he would act in the only language left to him. Consequence. I will emphasize again. I will not give tactical instructions that could be used to harm. What I will examine is the moral architecture that led to the act, that when every legal avenue is stacked against an oppressed person, they sometimes fashion their own justice from the broken materials of the system. Think of this as the psychology of rupture. When a man is forced into a role defined by others, when the institutions around him validate theft and cruelty, the only certainty left is that those institutions will not correct themselves. Lazarus saw that and decided to shift the balance. He worked within the patterns the supervisors had created, their schedules, their confidences, their own sense of safety, and transformed their assumed eternity into a sudden, irrevocable endpoint. That endpoint was meant to be final because he needed finality. Half measures would allow them to rebuild. Consider the ethics here with clear eyes. This is not a story to glorify blood, but to study consequence. When lawful structures fail to deliver justice, violence can seem like the only corrective left. Whether you accept that as inevitable, tragic, or unforgivable depends on where you stand morally. My role is not to judge you. My role is to make you see. If you stay with me, you will feel the weight of a system that ate its children and learn how one man pushed back with the only agency he had left. After the night they met, their laughter a brittle thing in the dark, what unfolded was swift and absolute. 9 men did not die by chance. They were taken by a force they had never expected from the world beneath their feet. But understand this, the event's terror is not merely the flames. It's the revelation that those who believed themselves safe within a web of secrecy could be exposed and broken in a single sober stroke of consequence. The panic in their final moments is the panic of men who mispriced justice. I will not indulge in lurid detail. The story's power lies in its moral clarity, not in the color of the smoke. What matters is that the camp, long governed by a rhythm of humiliation, exploded into a new rhythm, accountability writ in the worst light. When the 9 supervisors perished, the camp's structure, that delicate lattice of fear and commerce, collapsed. People who had been silent now whispered. Merchants who had looked the other way now counted their losses. The owners, faced with a scene that could no longer be explained by ordinary misfortune, had to reckon with a truth they had been taught to ignore. There is an uncomfortable lesson here. Violence is not a clean purifier. It leaves stains that history will debate for generations. But it also fractures myths. The myth of the infallible overseer. The myth that systems are self-correcting. For men like Lazarus, who had watched their loved ones taken and sold, those myths were thin paper. When paper meets flame, the truth is revealed. The rest is chaos, and then consequence. After the event, the plantation world tried to repair itself the only way it knew how, by rewriting narratives. They called it murder, blamed unknown incendiaries, insisted on random evil. They told themselves the forest had become a place of misfortune, not consequence. But beneath the public statements, amongst the workers, the story shifted into something else, a cautionary tale for the supervisors and a whispered legend for the oppressed. Secrets that had once hidden corrupt men were now the very thing that exposed them. Lazarus, when he vanished from the immediate aftermath, did not vanish from the communal imagination. To some, he was monstrous. To others, he was a liberator who had reclaimed a fragment of justice in a world that denied it. The truth occupies a strange space between law and legend. Those who held power ridiculed the legend to keep the rest compliant. But legends have a stubborn quality. They preserve truths that polite history tries to erase. There is also an institutional lesson. When oversight is weak and greed is strong, men will build private economies that corrupt the system. If those economies are protected by mutual blackmail, they become brittle. Exposure shatters them. This is not merely a story about one plantation. It is a broader warning about systems that allow the accumulation of unchecked authority. Where secrecy and mutual dependency exist, there will be seams. And where there are seams, consequences will follow. History sometimes sanitizes the language of atrocity. It prefers euphemism to fury because fury is disruptive. But you and I are not here for sanitization. We are here to hold a mirror to the anatomy of institutional cruelty and to watch without blinkers how it creates its own nemesis. Lazarus's act is a grim mirror, an answer to a ledger written in blood and theft. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What does justice mean when laws themselves are instruments of the powerful? When institutions are complicit, where can the wronged turn? That question is not rhetorical. It is the hinge on which many of history's most violent episodes pivot. Systems that deny recourse produce private remedies. Those remedies can be cathartic for a few and disastrous for many. The moral calculus is slippery, and it resists tidy judgments. But the point I insist on is this. If you want to prevent such ruptures, you do not demonize the desperate. You fix the systems that cultivated the desperation. Listen carefully. Blame is easy. Repair is hard. If you are chasing a takeaway, let it be this. Accountability requires structures that actually enforce accountability. When those structures fail, people invent their own. Whether those inventions are righteous or ruinous depends on the injustices being corrected and the cost exacted in return. Let's follow the ripples. After the supervisors' deaths, the immediate outcome was confusion, fear, and a scramble among the owners to reassert control. There were investigations, testimonies coerced under duress, and expedient verdicts. But the deeper consequence was psychological. Authority had been shown to be vulnerable. For the enslaved workforce, a new possibility had been glimpsed, that their suffering was not immutable. For the broader white community, a terrifying realization emerged. The order they relied on could be challenged from within the margins. What did that mean for social control? It meant the plantation owners doubled down, creating stricter oversight, more surveillance, and more punitive measures. Systems tend to respond to threats by tightening. But that tightening only confirmed the original diagnosis. The system was brittle and defensive because it was rotten at its core. For every guard posted, for every fine increased, the moral legitimacy of the entire enterprise waned further. There is a lesson about resilience here. Authoritarian structures can appear stable until a catalytic event reveals how fragile they are. The moment of collapse is often less dramatic than you think. It is a slow unraveling accelerated by one catalytic fracture. Lazarus's act was that catalyst. The men who had been so confident in their impunity found themselves part of a story that would outlive them, and their name would become a warning rather than a badge. History will argue about motives and methods forever. Some will call Lazarus a murderer, others a liberator. What I insist upon is that the moral complexity of his act cannot be reduced to a single word. It forces us to look at the scaffolding of society, the agreements, the quiet trades, the secrets exchanged in the dark, and to ask whether those scaffolds are worth preserving. When people are reduced to commodities, when law aligns with profit against life, the moral architecture of that society decays. I ask you now to think beyond binaries. Consider how institutions we trust, courts, corporations, management structures, can normalize cruelty with the same quiet mechanics as the supervisors did. Think about modern equivalents, accounting tricks, off-book stores, corners where oversight is light and temptation heavy. The specifics change, but the pattern repeats. That is why these old stories still matter. They are case studies in human behavior under structural pressure. Lazarus' story is a caution and a mirror. It tells us that unchecked authority corrodes human fabric. It also suggests that those pushed to the edge may respond in ways that demand ethical parsing, rather than immediate moral dismissal. We must learn to recognize the early signs of institutional rot before a ledger becomes a funeral pyre. Prevention is a moral duty. Reaction is messy. If you feel the urge to romanticize revenge, stop yourself. Romance erases consequences. The darker truth is that every act of irreversible force creates victims beyond the intended target. Families fractured, markets destabilized, a cycle of suspicion that lasted years. Yet in the quiet corners, among the men who had been told to accept their small lives as fate, a seed of self-possession grew. That is the human paradox. Great harm can produce a greater claim to dignity in those who endured it. Consider another paradox. The supervisor's thefts were small in the ledger's grand scheme, but morally enormous. The theft of a person's freedom, the sale of Dina, the reduction of a life to a price. Those were the true thefts. Financial theft was the mechanism, but not the crime's essence. The essence was moral debt owed to human beings whose existence the system refused to honor. When debts like that are unpaid, the interest compounds into radical acts. My final teaching before we close this descent is this. Systems will always find ways to hide their rot, but human memory is stubborn. People remember names, injustices, and small mercies. Those memories are the raw material of both legend and reform. We cannot legislate away every cruelty, but we can build structures that refuse to render people invisible. That is the hard work. It is the opposite of pyrotechnics. It is the work of coalition, oversight, and moral courage. You asked for forbidden history, and we have stepped into its shadow. Forbidden not because it is unknown, but because it makes the powerful uncomfortable. Stories like Lazarus's force institutions to confront their complicity. They make the comfortable uneasy. They unsettle the neat moral categories people like to live inside. If you are the kind of man who thrives on hidden truths, understand this. Knowing is not enough. You must decide what to do with what you know. Do you use it to build wiser systems? To demand accountability where oversight is weak? To refuse the ideology that measures human worth by productivity alone? Or do you clutch the knowledge as a secret talisman and let it calcify into cynicism? The choice matters because knowledge is an agent. It does things in the world. It either helps you repair the ledger or turn it into fuel for ruin. My role in this story has been to pry open the ledger, not to set the flame. That distinction illuminates responsibility. Remember also the older logic. Vengeance is a language spoken when law is mute. If you ever find yourself drawn to the romance of violent correction, ask whether structural remedies were attempted and denied. Ask whether the victims had other recourse. Then ask whether the cost of finality was worth the devastation left behind. These are difficult moral reckonings, the kinds that do not fit neatly on a placard or in a trending debate. They require courage to sit with. We close where we began, in a dark pine forest, with truth burning like a private lantern. Lazarus's act, whatever you name it, changed lives, toppled men, and exposed a ledger that had been furtively balanced for years. It taught that secrecy and greed eventually become combustible when fanned by the human refusal to remain property in a calculation of profit. The tale is not prescription. It is a warning and a mirror. It asks you to look honestly at the institutions you trust, the small cruelties you tolerate, and the stories you are willing to tell yourself about justice. If you leave this video with a single operating thought, let it be this: power hides in numbers and in silence. To hold power to account, you must do two things: cultivate evidence and summon courage. Evidence collapses secrets. Courage forces institutions to act. The rest is propaganda. If you want to work in the world as a man who refuses quiet complicity, start by learning the ledger in your life. Name the small cruelties. Expose the private economies that enrich at the expense of dignity. Demand accountability where oversight is weak. You've stared into a dangerous past. Let it not be merely entertainment. Let it be ignition, not of flames, but of reform. If you felt the weight of this story, leave a comment, share it with one man who needs to see what quiet injustice looks like, and subscribe. Walk away changed, not by the violence you witnessed, but by the resolve to prevent another ledger from writing human beings as mere entries.